Hello, everybody. We're here to talk about chapter 9, which is about motivation. So, um, a little bit of a disclaimer today. We are not going to be able to do everything. We will mainly focus on motivation in the context of the general principles of belongingness and of academic achievement. If I had tried to do everything, the lecture would have been very, very long. But the topics of food and sex are covered in your book. So definitely head over to your book to learn about those because surely they will appear in your quizzes and in your exam. Okay, so the basics of motivation, definition, instincts, and drives. So motivation, very simply put, is what moves us to act in a certain way. So, the important thing to understand here is that it's always constantly changing as our internal and our external states, so the circumstances around us, are changing. So it's really difficult to measure motivation because that's kind of constantly in motion. It's like trying to measure the ocean, right? So it's easiest to measure changes in intensity and direction of desire and need. So what are you headed for? How much are you driven by that? And the cause of the changes, instead of motivation directly, it just changes too fast. So, before we go too much further, I want to draw a distinction between instincts and reflexes. So, when we talked about learning, we talked about this a little bit, and an instinct is an unlearned, relatively fixed behavior pattern that is essential to the survival of the species. So, what does that mean? So, these things, if on an individual level, are not really related to keeping us alive with a couple of, exceptions. So, survival and self-preservation, right? If you don't have a survival instinct, if you don't have a self-preservation instinct, then you're not going to make it very long, right? But if you don't have a drive to reproduce, that doesn't matter for you, right? Like that does not impact the length of your life, most likely. Another example is parental care. So, you know, if you don't have a very strong drive to take care of your offspring, you will probably be fine, but the children will not, right? So the point here is that these are instincts that by and large, if we don't have them, the species dies out. Not so much about you specifically as an individual, with a couple of those exceptions, right? So reflexes versus instincts, right? Reflexes are what keep you alive, and instincts are what keep the species alive. So reflexes are simple and fast. So, the doctor taps you on the knee, your leg shoots out, basically. You know, there are lots and lots and lots of reflexes. I'm pretty sure there's a list of them in your book. And they're automatic, they're immediate. It's to a specific stimulus, right? Whereas instincts are more global. You're responding to kind of more complicated events. You're not necessarily responding to one thing that's happening around you. It's also interesting to note that reflexes involve direct neural pathways. They do not go to the brain. And the reason why they don't go through the brain is because it's too slow, right? So if you touch a hot stove and you have to wait for that impulse to go from your finger to your brain before you move it, you're going to burn yourself. So reflexes are really, really fast. They go around the brain, not through it. Whereas instincts are much more complicated. They do involve thinking as well as other things, but they're much more sophisticated than reflexes. Okay, so if you watch the lecture on learning, you will remember this slide. It wasn't exactly this slide, but it's very, very close to this slide. I took some things off of it just to make things clearer. And there's a lot of overlap in learning theory and in motivation theory. So now we're taking a learning theory principle, which is types of reinforcers. And it turns out that they're also types of drives, right? They're exactly the same, really. So we have the primary and the secondary, just like we do with reinforcers, and they're the same thing, right? So primary drives are basic biological needs, and secondary drives are those that acquire their value through association, right? So the example that you had for reinforcers was the clicker. However, that's not the best example. Technically, the clicker can be considered a secondary drive, but it's not a great example. That's just not the type of example that we usually use for a secondary drive. So, pick something more obvious if you're asked for it. Pick something like money, right? That's a really common example of a secondary drive is money. So that would be my suggestion to you if ever asked for an example of a secondary drive. So, drive reduction theory, right? So, drive reduction theory says that we're driven by this desire to maintain a steady state, right? That the theory calls homeostasis, which pretty much always involves reducing arousal. So, the theory is, you have some sort of imbalance, so you're thirsty, for example, and because your body has run out of enough fluid to sustain it. And then it tells you, hey, I'm thirsty. And then the drive is to go figure out where to find something to drink. And then you drink, and then you feel better, right? And you have returned to homeostasis. Sure, right? So that's definitely true, very basic, very, we can just kind of understand it from a um basic standpoint. But that's not all the motivation that we experience, right? What about things like boredom? What about things like desire for challenge, right? It cannot be explained by trying to reduce arousal, right? Because this is all about reducing arousal for drive reduction theory. When you have that imbalance in your homeostasis and that physiological need, you are increased arousal at that point, and you're trying to get it to go back to normal, right? So, for those of you who had a look at the procrastination lecture, this is part of it is actually one of the options that you can use to get some extra credit in the course. It is open all semester. So, if you are struggling with procrastination organization, go find that. It's in the extra credit module. Anyway, this slide comes pretty much directly from that lecture. And this law and is mainly about is mainly about how we have to change our arousal both ways to maintain the best learning environment for us. So if you look at it on the low end here, we have somebody sleeping. On the high end, we have somebody who's very stressed out. And in the middle, we have somebody who is operating at optimum learning. So if you look at the axes here, they're in the middle arousal and their performance is at maximum. So basically what that means is if you're under aroused, so if you're, not being stimulated enough by the lecture that you're getting, for example, then you're not going to learn very well. But likewise, if you are too stressed out, so you're, distracted by your own anxiety about learning, or you're in a testing environment or whatever it is, you're also not performing very well. So you have the same level of performance, you're underperforming both ways. It's just a question of why are you underperforming, right? So there are some factors that your performance depends on in addition to arousal, and they are, and there's more than these, but these are the main ones. Your skill level. So if whatever you're trying to do, you're very good at doing it already, you can operate within a larger um area of this curve and still do okay, right? Like you can be on the tired side or you can be on the stressed out side, but if your skill is very high, you're still going to do quite well. Your personality, right? If you are more on the introverted side, you're going to seek out kind of lower arousal situations and you'll be more comfortable there, than you will if you are more anxious. For task familiarity, this is about, how often have you done it? How often or how much do you understand what is expected of each part of the task? The more automatic it is, the easier it is for you to succeed, regardless of whether you're kind of more on the lower arousal or the higher arousal side. For task complexity, right? If it's a very simple task, again, you're going to be able to function okay on the kind of extreme ends here. But if it's really complicated, then you're probably going to need to be more towards the optimum middle side, right? So that's just an example of another kind of motivational model. And it's not always what this is showing us is that it's not always about reducing arousal, right? So sometimes you don't need to reduce your arousal. Sometimes you need to increase your arousal in order to be at the right level of motivation. So it's about regulating arousal. It's not about reducing it or increasing it. It's about regulating it and being in the right place for you. So the next part of the lecture is, where does motivation come from? So this is one of the many theories around motivation, and we see this kind of a lot in psychology. Maslow's hierarchy of needs applies to a lot of things, and also, many of you are aware that I teach social work as well, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs really comes into heavy play there as well. But the thing to understand here when we're talking about motivation is that the bottom rungs are really, really necessary to be in place already before you can be motivated towards the higher rungs. So, for example, you need to be fed and you need to be breathing and you need to, feel okay in order to be able to worry about how safe you are. So, you will give up safety for food, right? You'll make poor safety decisions in order to be fed, right? So that needs to be in place before you can focus on safety. And, those physiological needs and those safety needs need to be in place before you can focus on love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization, right? So I think that kind of makes sense on an instinctual level. And, you can be in a good place and be focusing on those higher rungs. But if something happens that destabilizes the bottom ones, you will let go of those higher ones until you stabilize, right? You just cannot focus on self-confidence and being independent and acknowledgement from others if you're hungry, right? If you don't have a home, right? So you can't focus on those higher level things if the basics are not there. Now, there has been some criticism of this theory, I think, based in misunderstanding of how the theory works. So the criticism goes something like, hey, Maslow does not take into account physiological needs and safety needs once you're moving to the top of the pyramid. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that that's how the theory goes. I think the nuance is that the the bottom rungs become less noticeable, but not less important as you move up, right? So if you have a home that is stable, that you're not struggling to make the rent or the mortgage, and you feel safe where you live and you have plenty of food and all of those things, they kind of fall into the background. You don't really think about that stuff if it is stable. You only think about that stuff if it is not stable, right? So I think that applies to every level of the pyramid, right? So, if you have stable friendships and stable family and stable relationships and all of that stuff, you don't think about it a whole ton. It's when things are destabilized that we focus back on them. And I think that's fine. Anyway, the bottom line here is that if you're struggling with basic needs, you need to address them first because they're the foundation that everything else sits on. You can't focus on getting good grades, you can't focus on getting a great job, you can't focus on any of that stuff unless your basic needs are met. Okay? So just to pop onto the job topic just a little bit. So you might have very high level goals for yourself for your academic for your professional goals, right? But if you're struggling to maintain housing, then maybe you should just take whatever job is there without having to worry about, is this my ideal job? Don't worry so much about, is this my own ideal job? Get stable and then find your ideal job. All right. So internal and external motivation. We're gonna come back to this next week, I think, when we talk about personality. But internal versus external motivation comes up a lot today. So it's really important that you understand the difference between them. So I'm hoping that the graphics will help here a little bit. So internal motivation. There's something about you that is pushing you towards whatever your goal is, right? You're finding it worthy and satisfying, and you want to do it. So, our little hiker here who is not to scale, he's hiking up this mountain because he is driven to do that because he enjoys the challenge, he enjoys the fresh air, whatever it is, but it's something about what he enjoys that is pulling him to do that, right? And then on the other side here is the little thinking guy, which is the icon that I always choose for, academics. And you know, you can be externally motivated to go to school for various reasons, and you're kind of going to cover that in your homework a little bit. But I find that people tend to be more successful when they're internally motivated to be academically successful. So there's for extrinsic. There's something about that object or goal that is pulling you to it. So on the one side here, we have the little clock. If you are running for a flight, that clock is your major external motivator, right? You're not running to get to that flight because you like running for a flight. You're running against the clock to get there, right? Or they're going to leave without you. The money is an external motivator, right? You're getting something for doing something. It's not that you just like, the touch and feel of money. It's that it gets you something, right? So that's an external motivator. Now, the question is, can a motivator be changed from one type to the other, and how? Um, and the answer is yes, of course, absolutely it can. Not all of them can, but for the most part, absolutely yes. So both ways, right? So you can take something that you are extrinsically motivated to do. So for example, your parents are pushing you towards college because they want something for you. They have a goal for you. Um, but it turns out, if you do it for a while and you realize like, hey, actually, I really enjoy this topic or that topic or the other topic, and you find that like the priorities of your parents become much less important, and now suddenly you're there because you want to be there, right? So we have taken an external motivator and turned it into an internal one. Another way to think about this is those of us with children, right? Um, that 8-year-old is probably not sitting down to do their homework without you sort of enforcing that. But for us adult students, right, we probably weren't sitting down to do our homework without being pushed by our parents either. But at some point, we decided, hey, I'm going to go to college. And so you do now sit down to do your homework without being pushed by your parents, presumably. And so, it at some point along the way, that external motivator, that push on that 8-year-old becomes an internal motivator. Now we're adults and we do it for ourselves. Now, you can do it the other way as well. And here is, a little bit of life advice coming from me. So if you've ever been hired for a job doing something that you love, okay? So let's take our little hiker guy. So he loves hiking. He thinks it's the best thing in the world. He's enjoying it. He's all these things. He decides to get a job as a Sherpa, right? The Sherpa is the guy who brings you up the mountain in this example. It could be a woman or a non-binary person too, but in this example, it's a guy, right? So, he's been hired to take you up the mountain. Well, now he's there because somebody's paying him, right? And the motivation is money, right? And yeah, it might be fun, but you have to be there whether it's a day you want to be there or not. And so the motivation to do something that you used to be internally motivated to do now becomes external, right? So you're seeing here the problem with measuring motivation, right? So one day he might be climbing the mountain, leading a pack, and that motivation is external. He's getting paid to do that. But let's say he takes a break, a vacation for a month, and he thinks to himself, like, I'm going to climb this mountain just for me, just for fun. That's an internal motivation. So you see the problem, right? Like it's very hard to track this, but it is quite easy to track why, right? It's very easy to track why that change has occurred. So yes, you can change motivation from internal to external and back again. Happens all the time and usually, kind of naturally over time. We don't see a lot of 18-year-olds being incentivized with M&Ms to use the bathroom, right? So, there comes a point where we become internally motivated. Now, which kind of motivator is more powerful? Um, Internal motivators are usually much more powerful and much more lasting than external motivators. So, there comes a point where money is good and all, but you have enough money. You don't need any more money. What you really want is this like internal drive to do something for you. So the internal motivators are in general much stronger and they last much longer. All right, so incentives. They're a type of motivator. Incentive theory focuses on the role of external motivators. So we're not talking about internal motivators right now. We're talking about external ones. These are the ones where there's something about that object or goal that is pulling you toward it. So an incentive is any kind of stimulus, that's the fancy psychology word, right? That motivates behavior. It could be a reward for completing the behavior, so an A for excellent work, money for employment, or a threatened punishment, right? So the incentives can work can work either way, you know. Um, so there's this is a big part of marketing, if you're interested in marketing, it's a very deep field. You can do entire PhDs on incentive theory, right? So the value of incentives definitely can change over time and according to circumstances, right? So some examples of that. So you have the carpool lane available to you and it's $25. Well, if you're 2 hours early for where you need to be, very good chance you're not going to do that. You're going to stay in whatever lane that you're in. But now let's say that you're in labor. You're in active labor, you're about to have a baby, it's bumper to bumper traffic, except in that carpool lane. Well, what are you going to do? You're obviously not going to care that it's going to cost you $25, right? The incentive is to not be in the carpool lane, but it is not powerful enough to overcome the need that you have, right? So, the value of those incentives certainly change. Also, just back to the example of the M&M for going to the bathroom, like the value of that M&M is very high for that 2-year-old, that 3-year-old. It is not particularly high for, the 30-year-old, right? We don't need it. It doesn't matter. So a little kind of news you can use here on incentives. When we talked about learning, we talked about reinforcements and how reinforcements are much more effective in motivating behavior change than punishments are. So rewards help build motivation to do a behavior instead of not doing one. Okay, they reinforce consistently and predictably. And they help you build a feeling of autonomy, which is just a very fancy way of saying, like, I'm in control, right? Like, I can earn this reward. I'm in control of that situation. And so, like, there's some caveats that we need to understand that we did not talk about when we talked about learning. So, if you do reinforcement incorrectly, it can really damage the locus of your motivation. It can really take something that you're intrinsically motivated to do and damage it, right? So, how do we do reinforcement correctly so that we preserve intrinsic motivation, right? So, those rewards, they need to be really precise. They need to be very specific about what the performance standards are. So, sports are a really, really good example of this. So, one of the very simple ways is that it might improve outperforming others. So, you go to a swim meet and you outswim everybody else and you win. Right? So the winning itself is a reinforcement that like, hey, good job, yay, you outperform that person. That can really work to drive intrinsic motivation. However, if you are given tangible rewards, then very quickly your motivation becomes external. It becomes more about like the tangible reward. So the simplest one to think about is money, right? So if you win for swimming the swim meet, you win $100 for swimming the swim. Well, it probably needs to be bigger than that. Let's say you win $100,000 for winning the swim meets, right? Um, then very quickly your motivation turns from intrinsic to extrinsic, right? So when we are talking about motivating behavior in children, and I mean this works for anybody of any age, or it also works for animals, right? But when we avoid the tangible part, when we do not buy grades from your children. Do not say, if you get an A in this class, I will give you $100, right? Because whatever intrinsic motivation that they had, you just blew it up. So like really what you need to do is to focus on avoiding those tangible rewards. Use praise, but be real specific about what you're praising, right? Like don't praise things like, hey, you're so smart, because what happens if, then you get a B, like they're like, am I smart? I don't know. You know, so use praise, like, oh, you did really good work on that exam. You got an A on that exam. Very good work. You really put that effort in, and I can see that you put that effort in. So you're praising what they did, not what they are, right? So when you praise what people are, you are so pretty. You are so smart. What happens when you aren't pretty anymore because now you're old, or something happened and um your external self isn't what it used to be, or whatever, like, then what happens to your self-concept, right? It was external, and it's not about who you how much work you do or anything like that, right? So we got to be really careful about that. So what is it always possible to avoid tangible rewards? No, of course it is not, right? But um you know we should do what we can to avoid tangible rewards. So when you're talking about children, for example, um often it's much more powerful to say, instead of, I'll buy you a toy for, completing the behavior chart, which we're about to talk about in a slide here. But, instead of that, saying, you and mommy are gonna spend some time together, for being so, for whatever it is that they've done that you're trying to incentivize, right? That's typically much more powerful. So we just have to be really, really careful about those tangible rewards, because we can pull that motivation from the intrinsic side to the extrinsic side really easily, and it's hard to put back once you've done that. Okay, so as promised, this is an incentive highlight. If you are driven to look at what's under that not safe for work sticker and what I cut off at the bottom, then you can follow that URL if you like. But I liked this one because it gives us both good and bad examples. It's a joke, of course, right? But it gives us both good and bad examples. So for the washing dishes one here, 12 pack of your favorite beer, that's a tangible reward, right? Put toilet seat down, the reward is no nagging for a week. That's an intangible reward. But it's also you're removing something. So, just be a little bit tricky about it's a little bit tricky to use negative reinforcement on a sticker chart. But you can do it. You can say, like, no dishes for a week, or whatever. Like, you don't have to do the dishes for a week, whatever it is. But usually for behavior charts, we try to go for positive reinforcement. So we're adding something to the situation. It can work the other way. You just want to be a little bit careful about it. So a bad example, so bathe the Rugrats, haha. The bad example is, I won't donate your favorite pit stain t-shirt. So that's more of a threat. you know that's not a reward, right? So you can't say, like, you can't say, like, I'm not going to do this terrible thing to you as on your behavior chart. Like, let's try to avoid that, right? So anyway, I just wanted to give this example to you. Okay, so motivation for belongingness. Um, the reason why I picked this instead of focusing on food or sex is because I think it's easy to skip over, and to kind of miss why it is important. Um, but it is really, really important. And because if you don't have a sense of belongingness with a group, then it is very, very hard to get motivated to do a lot of things. So I'm starting at the bottom here, right? So having a peer group with those similar goals can really help you. This is why having a study group where you study for exams together has a really, truly significant impact on your exam grade. It really helps you stay motivated to study in addition to all the other good things. But of bouncing off ideas and being able to explain things to each other, those are all good too. But really, at the very core, having similar goals can really help build your motivation, especially if it like was a little shaky, right? So, also a little bit of detail around belongingness, it's pretty individual. It's pretty stable across time. Introversion, extroversion, partially captures belongingness. We're going to talk about this next week too, when we talk about personality. But there are other parts to introversion and extroversion, but one part of it is belongingness, how driven we are to belong in any one situation. Um, you know, there are sex differences in belongingness, but they are culturally conditioned. They have nothing to do with like biological difference or anything like that. It has nothing to do with that. It's that in our culture, women, female children are taught implicitly and explicitly, so just kind of by the images that you see in the media, but also, explicitly by our parents, that you should value and seek connectedness more than males. So a concrete example of this is, women are taught to remember birthdays and to make sure that there's a cake and to do this and to do that to foster that connectedness moment in the birthday moment. Men, this is much less of an expectation. So that's just one of many bajillions of examples. Okay, so now is your time to go watch the video about the conditions needed for belongingness. She has a number of them that she goes through, and I really do want you to think that through in the context of your own life. Um, because, and this is another reason why this is so important for us to cover, because at some point along the way, we are all going to be in charge of somebody's group experience. So, at the most basic level, you're going to be responsible for the group experience of your family, right? If you're the parent in the home, you're going to be the responsible for that. Or maybe you're somebody's boss, or you're going to be somebody's boss someday. And so you're responsible for that sense, creating that sense of belonging. So at some point along the way, we are all going to end up being responsible for that. And I think we all understand that the environment created by the person running the show um, is critical to how people feel, acting in that show, for just to continue on that metaphor, right? So, being aware of what factors are involved in belongingness and being able to foster those is a really important investment in running a strong family and running a strong workplace, whatever it might be. So, this video is really provided to you in order to help you think that through in the context of your own life. You might not have, a family of your own yet, but you came from one, and you should definitely think about, even if you don't have a family of your own, like what of these conditions for belongingness were fostered in my family and which were not, right? When I go to work, what are the conditions that are fostered and which are not? Like what's working, what isn't, is another way to think about that. So that's why you have this video, and that's why you should spend some time with it. Of course, it's linked in Canvas and from Facebook, YouTube. Okay. So, motivation for achievement in academics, we're just going to touch on this very, very gently, but this is part of what we've been talking about basically all semester about really creating a environment for yourself where you understand what you need to academically succeed, and motivation is a key part of that. So, need for achievement in your book, you'll see it referred to as NACH, right? Where does it come from? So, you remember how earlier we were talking about how motivation can change from, one type of extrinsic or intrinsic motivation to the other. So, in this conversation, we're talking about how the need for achievement moves from the extrinsic, what your parents expect of you, usually, it's not always parents, but what your parents expect of you, to your internal motivation, where you are the one driving the academic achievement. So here's how you do it, right? You have to have um, a way to observe other people who have that drive. You might not have a lot of examples of this, or you might have examples of people who are demonstrating the very opposite, and you're reacting to that either way, right? And you have to have um, some kind of encouragement, or it is very difficult to have a high need for achievement. If there is not somebody saying, yeah, keep going, come on, you can do this, look how I do it, then this can come from your parents or for your professors or your mentors or whoever, right? But it really is important that it's there. And, to have those difficult but achievable challenges, if you can't reach it, no matter how hard you try, you're not going to try, right? So it has to be hard, but you have to be able to do it. It has to be in some sort of reach. And striking that balance is really challenging, and it also changes as your skill level changes. And then at the top here, I've put a desire to overcome obstacles and meet high standards of excellence. So if you are not interested in challenge, you're not going to have a high need for achievement, right? If you're not interested in being like, oh, I want to tackle that, that looks hard but doable, I really want to do that, then, it's going to be very, very difficult to really foster a need for achievement. You have to be able to feel like you are in control enough of what you can do to really buckle down and work and overcome obstacles. And we'll talk about that more in personality as well. So I made this little slide for you. You may or may not have seen this in a different form if you went to the page on my instructional site about improving your grade. So if you did, you've seen this in a visually different way. But basically, the bottom line is, you want to set these like very specific but achievable goals, and then have this really strong routine that helps you get there. If you don't have the right space to work in, you're not going to be able to work. You just art, going to be able to produce something that you feel represents what you can do if you're working in a space that doesn't give you the quiet that you need or the tools that you need, like literally the tools that you need. I'm talking to you right now from in front of a 45-inch monitor. If you think about how big that monitor is, the reason why I do that is because teaching you and teaching other students is the majority of the work that I do, and being able to say, put your PowerPoint slide next to your book and to work on them side by side really helps my efficiency, right? And therefore it helps my achievement of being, a good professor for you. So like that space that you're working in is really important. So you're not going to be able to succeed if you're not comfortable where you're working, or it will be very difficult. If you're not sleeping, if you're not eating well, if you're not getting the right amount of exercise, you're also not going to do as good a job as you would otherwise do. If you don't have any reinforcements for your goals achieved, positive or negative, but hopefully positive, then like, and remember, positive reinforcement is just easier to do, right? Like to put something in to reinforce a behavior is easier to do than to take something away to reinforce a behavior. Because usually whatever that thing is comes back again, and like other reasons, right? But the reason why I put positive reinforcement here is not because negative reinforcement doesn't work, but because it's better. So, for your goals achieved to be reinforced for that, like that's really important. Being a lone wolf, for those of us who are introverted, we're kind of driven towards being alone, towards working alone, but we need to have those resources available to us because we're not always going to know what we're supposed to be doing or the best way to do it, and we're sometimes going to have questions, and that's all fine. It's fine to mostly work on your own, and you might not need help very often, but we all need help sometimes. So then you want to be able to have the skills to manage complicated tasks, right? And that's going to look different for everyone. What you need to do to break down tasks into something that works for you. But if you can't do it, you're not going to be able to do complicated stuff. You're just going to like stare at the blank screen and not have any idea what you're supposed to do next. So, you want to connect your coursework to your personal interests if you can. This is not always going to apply, right? You're not always going to be taking a class on something that interests you, but this is something that I really focus on in my classes, both this class and in social work, that we're trying to connect the work that you have to do to something that makes sense to you, that is applicable to you. It might not be like a personal interest per se, but academic achievement applies to, for this is just an example, right? Academic achievement applies to everybody in college. It's an issue to everyone in college. So, like that's why we spend so much of our time applying the concepts that we learn in this class to um, academics, because that is going to apply to everybody who's in the class. So the ditto for time management skills, exactly the same. And really, really important is tracking your progress and being able to reflect on your successes. And that's different than reinforcing your goals achieved, because you're not necessarily going to have reached a goal to track your progress. Okay. You might not have been able to get there, but to be able to say like, okay, I'm on my way there and I've done a good job trying to get to where I'm going, and I'm going to keep doing that, is really important skill. Okay. So we're all done. Aren't you glad that I did not cover two more sections? We're all done for today. If you have any questions, of course, come to office hours or send me an email or a message. All right. Thanks so much. Bye.